Okay, let's go on with this second part of the lecture. I hope that in the meantime you have grabbed a big and nice cup of coffee to go on. So we have the subject, the grammatical or syntactic definition. This is something you already know. You know that the subject is a noun phrase, including noun clauses, right? That the subject and the predicate agree in number as well as person, and that in English the subject usually takes the initial position in the sentence, whereas in Spanish and other pro-drop languages, its position is not highly fixed. So now we're going to refer a little bit to this position. The subject in Spanish can take a pre-verbal or post-verbal position, right? And taking into account this position of the subject, we can speak of two types of sentences. We can speak of a predicative sentence when the subject occupies the initial position, oración predicativa in Spanish, like sentences like the following sentences. Los perros ladran, los niños juegan, right? According to Di Tullio, sentences A and B could be answers to questions like ¿qué hacen los perros o qué hacen los niños? And then we can have a sentence with a post-verbal subject that is called a presentative sentence, which answers the question ¿qué ocurrió? It presents an event or introduces an entity into discourse. A sentence like murió el perro or se produjo un atentado. So even though the position of the subject in Spanish is freer than English, that doesn't mean we don't have in our language certain constraints. You know that English is a non-pro-drop language, which means that all sentences must have a subject, an overt subject in initial position for the declarative sentence to be considered grammatical. Well, in Spanish, we can have a pre-verbal subject, a post-verbal subject, or we can have no overt subject at all, and the sentence is still grammatical, right? But as I said, there are certain constraints. For example, the constraints are related to the thematic role of the subject. So, in a sentence like murió el perro, the thematic role of the subject, el perro, in general is a thematic role of a patient or an experiencer, okay, or a theme, but not an agent, like in the case of los perros ladran or los niños juegan. So in the case of predicative sentences, the thematic role of the subject in general is that of an agent. Remember that I mentioned in part 1 of the video that we prototypically associate the syntactic function of subject with the semantic role of an agent. Well, in predicative sentences, that's what happens. In general, the subject is an agent. But in presentative sentences, the thematic role of the subject in general is that of a patient, a theme, or experiencer. Because if you come to think of it, let's see, murió el perro. El perro cannot be the doer of any action, cannot be the agent, because he does not perform the action of dying with volition intentionally, right? It's something that the dog experiences, you know? The same happens with se produjo un atentado. El atentado no hace nada. Es algo que acaece, que ocurre, que sucede, right? That is why we say un atentado has the thematic role of a theme. Do you get my point? And there are other constraints that, for example, are related to the type of verb at stake, because in general, in predicative sentences, the verbs are verbos intransitivos y negativos, And in the case of presentative sentences, the verbs are usually intransitivos, inacusativos. Don't worry about that, about those labels. We will see them later on when we have the chance of reviewing the topic estructuras temáticamente marcadas. But I just mentioned this for you to take it into account when you have to handle and to tackle that material, okay? So let's move on now to the semantic definition of the subject. The subject can be considered as one of the arguments required by the predicate, un sujeto argumental. So in all the examples we saw already, like in my backpack is in the car, my backpack is the subject and at the same time is an argument selected for the preposition in. Or in the case of my father broke the glass, well, my father is the subject and at the same time he has the thematic role of an agent and is an argument, right? But then the subject, the syntactic subject, can be considered as an external argument, not required by the predicate. That is to say, un sujeto no argumental. What do we mean by this? Well, remember that there was an example with the verb to rain, that I said rain is a zero-place predicate because that predicate does not select for any argument for its meaning to be complete. We said that we cannot produce a sentence like the clouds rain or the sky rains, but there was a symbol, a red symbol, remember? Well, that symbol was signaling that even though the verb to rain does not select for any argument, there's something required there. And in the case of English, as English is a non-prodrop language, we need expletives. So we have sentences like it's winter or it's 12 o'clock, right? So in those sentences, the word it is not a referring expression as the pronoun it in an example like, I don't know, you took my cell phone and I say to you, give it to me. Okay, so that it is referential. It is a referring expression because we can identify the entity in the extralinguistic world, which is my cell phone. But in the cases of it's winter or it's 12 o'clock or it's raining, that it is not referring to anything, is empty, is devoid, it's empty of meaning, it has no meaning, okay? It is placed there for syntactic reasons because of the type of language English is, because English is a non-prodrop language and we need an overt subject in initial position. An overt means an explicit subject. We need to see it there, okay? But in Spanish, as I said before, we can have sentences with a preverbal subject, a postverbal subject, or with no subject. And our sentences are still grammatical, like es invierno, right? So this is an impersonal sentence. Yet it is grammatical in our language. So in English, we need to use expletives. They are called expletives. These dummy empty it's, and for example, the existential there. In the case of the sentence, there are interesting people here. We have a subject, a real subject, a notional subject. Interesting people. We do have a subject in that sentence, but the subject has been moved to a postverbal position. And we said that in English we need a subject in initial position. That is why we have added an expletive, an existential there. that allows us to move the subject to a post-verbal location. Do you follow me? So these expletives are not arguments because they are empty of meaning. They are not argumental. They are not considered a referring expression. Okay? They only perform a syntactic function in the sentence because in the case of there are interesting people, there, when we analyze it from the point of view of syntax, there is the subject 1, interesting people is the subject 2. Okay? So they perform a syntactic function. They are the subject of the sentence. But in terms of meaning, they have no meaning at all. Okay? Then let's move on to the predicate. We have the syntactic definition. And this concept you also know it very well. The head of the predicate is usually a verb because it has inflections that show subject-verb agreement, person and number, or that characterize the whole sentence, such as tense, mood, and aspect. And remember that at the beginning of the first part of the video, I said that we usually associate the predicate with the verb because the predicate has as its head a finite verb, right? But what happens with the semantic definition? We also anticipated something before. We also said that semantic predicates can belong to other categories, such as adjectives, nouns, prepositions, and in some cases adverbs. Like in the case of el día está hermoso, right? And we said that, okay, hermoso, which is an adjective, requires, selects for an argument that could be a person or a thing, like in this case, el día, right? And remember that we said there's a verb to be there, present, okay? That is neither a referring expression nor a predicate. The same happens with the book is on the table. The predicate is a preposition on that requires something to be located over something, over a place, whatever you name it, okay? And again, we have the verb to be that is not a referring expression and is not a predicate or a predicate, neither. So what happens here? Given that these predicates belong to other categories, they do not show inflections. So they require the presence of a verbal container that adds this inflectional information. And that's the role of the verb to be, and in Spanish, ser o estar, right? They are a mere container for the non-verbal predicate. They add the inflectional information that is required in the sentence. Remember that at this point, there's like, a synergy between syntax and semantics. They interplay somehow, okay? So the verb to be, ser o estar in Spanish, is present as a container of the nonverbal predicate, right? That only happens with predicates that belong to other categories that are not verbs, of course. And now I will explain to you the difference between predicate and predicator. Remember that at the beginning I mentioned this and I said we will see it later on. Okay, so we have the term predicate. Predicate is a word category. As I said, it can be any word category, a verb, a noun, an adjective, a preposition. It identifies element in the language system, as simple as that. And then we have the predicator. And the predicator is a group or group of words which is not a referring expression. Remember that When analyzing the sentences, I told you that in order to identify the predicate of the sentence, we should identify first the referring expressions. Once we can strip them away, we have our predicator in the sentence standing alone, let's say. So a word or group of words which is not a referring expression and which makes the most specific contribution to the meaning of the sentence. And it says most specific contribution to the meaning because remember that we say that the predicate is the one that selects for and requires arguments for the sentence to be meaningful, right? All the arguments move around this predicate, and it's not the other way around. Since the predicate, this predicator in this case, is the one that selects not only the number of predicates but also the types of predicates. Remember the example of the rock is intelligent? Okay, so you see the arguments move around the predicate. Intelligent does not call for any kind of noun. You need to have certain features. It has to be an animate subject. Okay, we cannot have an inanimate subject like the rock, for example. And it identifies the semantic role played by a particular word or group of words in a particular sentence. So, to cut a long story short, the predicate, again, as when I try to explain the concept of argument, is any word category that has the potential to be put into use in actual discourse. And when it's put into use in this actual discourse, and when it is put, when it is used, and when being used can select for different arguments, number and type of arguments, then the predicate is not any longer in this vacuum isolated, but it becomes the predicator. Okay? It becomes the predicator of the sentence. So that's the difference. The predicate, if I say in isolation, if you see the word in, which is a preposition, is a predicate. It's a word category, and you know it has the potential to become a predicator when put into use in a particular context. Now, in the example, my backpack is in the car, in that case, that predicate turned into a predicator because it was put into use. And then I also mentioned something about the verb to be as being a container, you know, or el ser o estar. And I said the verb to be is always a container. The verb to be is the one that adds the inflections that are needed by the non-verbal predicates. But I also said something about a special case. And this is the case of the identity predicate. And this is a case in which the identity relation is special because of its very basic role in the communication of information. And this happens when you have two referring expressions that are being somehow joined by these verbs, okay? And you have a sentence like, Mary is my mom. And remember that I told you that in order to identify the predicator of a sentence, we need to identify first the arguments, the referring expressions. Mary is one referring expression. My mom is the other referring expression. The interesting thing here is that they both refer to the same entity in the extralinguistic world. So if we strip away them, we only get the verb to be. So that is the only case in which the verb to be functions as the predicator in a sentence. In most of the other cases, you will find the verb to be working together with a non-verbal predicate, whether it be an adjective or a noun or a preposition. Okay? So take into account that other instances of the verb to be, as we have seen, are simply a grammatical device, a mere container, for linking a predicate that is not a verb, adjective, preposition, or noun, to its first argument. Okay? So there are a couple of final comments I would like to tell you. I think I mentioned this, but I will do it again just in case. The semantic analysis of a sentence into predicator and arguments, what we have seen today, does not correspond in most cases to the traditional grammatical analysis, to this traditional approach of a sentence into subject and predicate. Although there is some overlap between the semantic and the grammatical analysis, as we have seen, sometimes they may overlap and sometimes they need each other to, compensate for the analysis. They work as a complement, if you want to see it that way. So this is not that we're going to talk about syntax and we forget about semantics, or that we analyze semantics and completely forget about syntax. They are interrelated, they interplay, okay? And we need from the two perspectives sometimes to be able to analyze or deal with a particular concept. And well, that's it. I hope the explanations have been clear enough. This is not an easy topic, but all the questions you may have are mostly welcome in our forum or during our online classes. But I hope the concepts you have seen in the chapter I hope they are clearer now. Okay, so thank you very much and see you, I don't know, next time. Bye.